The Missouri sky bled into crimson as the sun began its descent behind the Ozark Mountains. Nathan Wells adjusted the strap of his backpack and smiled at his girlfriend, Amber Collins. Both 26, they had planned this hiking trip for months, an escape from the daily grind of Chicago to explore the less-traveled trails of one of America's most stunning natural regions. "Are you sure this is the way?" Amber asked, glancing again at the map in her hands. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail and small beads of sweat dotted her forehead. Nathan nodded with his usual confidence. "Trust me. The park ranger said this trail leads to a view very few tourists ever see." It was May of 1998. The weather was perfect for camping, cool nights and days that were warm but not suffocating. The couple had told their families they would check into a nearby motel that evening before continuing their journey the next day. "We should get a picture here," Nathan suggested, pulling out his Nikon camera. He was an amateur photographer, and the Ozarks offered landscapes worthy of a travel magazine. Amber posed by a large tree, the valley sprawling out behind her. The photograph would capture her brilliant smile, her red jacket tied around her waist, and the last rays of sunset filtering through the leaves. What Nathan didn't know was that this would be one of the last pictures of the two of them together. They decided to press on a little further before it grew completely dark. The trail became less and less defined, but Nathan insisted they were heading in the right direction. A flicker of unease began to stir in Amber, but she trusted her boyfriend's instincts. "Just another half hour," he promised. "If we don't find the lookout, we'll turn back." At some point, the marked path vanished entirely. What should have been a warning sign became an invitation to explore. The terrain grew more rugged and the shadows stretched long as the sun finally disappeared. "Nathan, it's getting late," Amber said, her voice betraying a hint of worry. "We should head back to the car." He reluctantly agreed. "You're right, we can try again tomorrow." It was only when they turned to go back that they realized something deeply unsettling. They weren't sure which way they had come. In their excitement to discover new places, they had paid little attention to their step. "Don't worry," Nathan said, trying to remain calm as he pulled out his compass. "We just need to head west." But what neither of them knew was that they were being watched. Miles away, in a small motel at the foot of the mountains, the phone rang at the reception desk. Frank Wells, Nathan's father, was on the line, his voice tight with concern. It was midnight, and he hadn't received the call his son had promised to make upon arriving at the motel. "I'm sorry, sir," the receptionist said. "We have no check-in registered under the name Wells or Collins." A cold knot formed in Frank's stomach. He knew his son. Nathan was meticulous with his plans. If he said he would call, he would have, unless something had stopped him. That same night, Frank called the local police to file a missing persons report. "My son and his girlfriend are hiking in the Ozarks," he explained, his voice strained. "They were supposed to check into a motel tonight, but they never arrived." The officer who took the report tried to reassure him. "Mr. Wells, it's common for hikers to lose track of time or decide to camp spontaneously. I suggest you wait until morning." But Frank couldn't wait. By first light the next morning, he was already driving from St. Louis toward the Ozark Mountains. A recent photograph of Nathan and Amber on the passenger seat, and a knot in his stomach that tightened with every mile. When he arrived at the trailhead, he found Nathan's Toyota Corolla parked exactly where it should be. All their belongings were still in the trunk. Extra clothes, supplies for several days, and the detailed itinerary Nathan had printed out. The official search began that afternoon. Park rangers, police, and volunteers combed the main trails and surrounding areas. K-9 units followed the couple's scent to a certain point on the path, but then lost the trail near a stream that crossed it. "The water can throw the dogs off," one of the officers explained to Frank, "but we'll keep looking." Days turned into weeks. The search intensified, employing helicopters and specialized mountain rescue teams. The story of the mysterious case hit the national news. Chicago couple vanishes without a trace in the Ozark Mountains. Amber's parents joined Frank in the search, setting up a small command center at the local motel. They offered a reward for any information. The local community was sympathetic, but no one seemed to have any concrete leads. One theory began to circulate. Perhaps the couple had chosen to disappear to start a new life. But those who knew Nathan and Amber vehemently rejected the idea. They both had stable jobs, close families, and future plans. Nathan had just been accepted into a graduate program, and Amber had mentioned to her friends that an engagement might be coming soon. As summer progressed, the searches became less frequent. The case remained open, but with no new leads, resources were diverted to other matters. Frank refused to give up. He drove to the mountains every weekend, handing out flyers and speaking to anyone who might have seen something. What no one knew then was that the answer to the mystery would lie hidden for 8 long years, etched into a stone that no one had noticed, with coordinates that would lead to a discovery as disturbing as it was unexpected. Time passed inexorably for Frank Wells. Every morning when he woke, his first thought was still of Nathan. Where was his son? What had truly happened in those mountains? The uncertainty was a slow poison, eroding his health and his spirit. Frank's life had become a ritual of endless searching. He kept a wall in his house dedicated to the case, covered with maps of the Ozarks meticulously marked with every searched area, photographs of Nathan and Amber, newspaper clippings, and a list of contacts he had made during his tireless investigations. Amber's parents, Robert and Diana Collins, had found a different path to cope with their grief. After 2 years of active searching, they held a memorial service for their daughter. Frank did not attend. To him, a memorial meant giving up, and he was not ready to do that. "Frank, you have to find a way to move on," Diana Collins told him during one of their increasingly infrequent phone calls. "This is destroying you." "I can't," he replied simply. "Not until I know what happened to them." By 2003, 5 years after the disappearance, the case had become just another file in the cold case archives. The local police kept the investigation technically open, but with no new leads, it was just paper forgotten in a drawer. Detective Marcus Reeves, who had been in charge of the case from the beginning, stayed in touch with Frank. Not out of professional obligation, but from a mix of compassion and his own frustration at being unable to solve the mystery. "Sometimes cases like this get solved in the most unexpected ways," Reeves told Frank over coffee on the 5th anniversary of the disappearance. "I've seen situations where after decades someone stumbles upon something by pure chance." Frank nodded, clinging to that sliver of hope. "That's why I keep coming back to the mountains. Someone must have seen something. Something must have been left behind." What Frank didn't know was that the detective's words would turn out to be almost prophetic. In May of 2006, almost exactly 8 years after the disappearance, a team of geologists from the University of Missouri was conducting a study on erosion in the Ozark Mountains. Dr. Alan Mercer and his assistant, doctoral student Sophia Chen, were working in a remote area cataloging rock formations. "Professor, come look at this," Sophia called out, kneeling beside a rock partially covered in moss. Dr. Mercer walked over, intrigued by the tone in his assistant's voice. "What have you found?" "I think someone carved something here," she replied, carefully cleaning the moss away with a small brush. Underneath the green layer, markings appeared that were clearly not natural. Numbers and letters crudely etched into the limestone surface. Their coordinates, Dr. Mercer murmured, pulling out his GPS to compare them. And is there something else? Initials, I think. NW and a C. The initials were followed by what looked like a date, 05-15-98. Sophia frowned. Who would go to the trouble of carving coordinates on a rock in the middle of nowhere? Someone who wanted something to be found, the professor answered, a chill running down his spine as he took out his satellite phone. I'm calling the authorities. This doesn't feel right. Detective Marcus Reeves, on the verge of retiring after 25 years on the force, received the call while clearing out his desk. When he heard the initials and the date, his senses went on high alert. Don't touch anything else, he instructed. We're on our way. Reeves immediately called Frank Wells. After 8 years of calls with bad news or no news at all, this time his voice carried something different, a spark of hope. Frank, they've found something. I don't want to get your hopes up, but it matches Nathan and Amber's initials, and the date is exactly when they disappeared. Frank felt his legs give way. He sank into a chair, his mind racing as he tried to process the information. Coordinates? You think Nathan left them? But why didn't we find them before? It's an area that wasn't well covered during the initial searches, Reeves explained. Too remote, too rugged. The search teams focused on more probable areas. The next day, Frank joined Reeves and a small investigation team. The geologists led them to the rock, now marked with yellow police tape. Frank knelt before the stone, his trembling fingers gently tracing his son's initials. It's his handwriting, he murmured, tears welling in his eyes. I know the way he made the N. The team used a GPS to pinpoint the coordinates etched into the rock. They were about 2 miles away in a particularly steep part of the mountains. It's going to be a tough hike, one of the officers warned, studying the topographical map. The terrain is treacherous. I've waited 8 years, Frank replied, standing up with renewed determination. I can walk as far as I need to. The group moved slowly, pushing their way through dense vegetation. As they neared the coordinates, the ground became increasingly dangerous, with steep slopes and loose rocks. Be careful, Reeves warned. One wrong step here could be fatal. When the GPS indicated they were less than 100 yards from the marked point, one of the officers up ahead stopped abruptly. Sir, I think you should see this. In front of them, partially hidden by undergrowth, was the entrance to what looked like a cave. It wasn't a large opening, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was definitely not natural. It looked as if there had been a rock slide at some point, leaving only this small access. The coordinates point right here, the officer confirmed, showing his GPS. Frank took a step forward, but Reeves stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. Wait, Frank. We need proper equipment. We don't know what's in there or how stable it is. My son could be in there, Frank insisted, his voice breaking. I know, Reeves said softly, and that's why we're going to do this right. We can't risk losing evidence or getting someone else hurt. Reluctantly, Frank agreed to wait. A perimeter was established around the cave, and a team specializing in cave rescue and evidence recovery was called in. As they waited, Frank couldn't tear his eyes away from that spool dark opening. After 8 years of unanswered questions, he felt that the truth was just a few feet away, hidden in the blackness of that cave. What no one could imagine was the horror that awaited them inside. A horror that would reveal not only the fate of Nathan and Amber, but also the existence of an evil that had lain hidden in the peaceful woods of the Ozarks for years. The wait was unbearable for Frank. Each minute seemed to stretch into an eternity as the caving team prepared their gear, He watched impatiently as they checked headlamps, secured ropes, and tested communication systems. "How much longer are they going to be?" he asked Detective Reeves for the third time. "Frank, I understand your frustration," Reeves answered patiently. "But these people know what they're doing. An unstable cave could collapse if we don't take the right precautions." Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the team was ready. Two specialists approached the entrance, examining it carefully before proceeding. "The opening is small, but it widens out after a few feet," one of them reported after peering inside with a powerful flashlight. "Looks like a rock slide sealed the main entrance, leaving just this access point." With careful movements, the first caver slipped through the opening, followed by his partner. Both wore cameras to document everything they found. A communication wire kept them connected to the team outside. Frank never looked away from the entrance, as if he could see through the rock and the darkness. Reeves stood beside him, equally tense. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled. "Control, this is Explorer 1, came the caver's clipped voice. We've found something." Frank held his breath. "There are human remains," the voice continued. "A skeleton. Looks like it's been here for years." A sepulchral silence fell over the group outside. Frank closed his eyes, his entire body trembling. "Can you identify anything?" Reeves asked into the radio, his voice professionally controlled despite the circumstances. "There are remnants of clothing. A backpack with some belongings," the explorer replied. "And, Detective, there's something carved into the cave wall. It looks like a message." The next few hours unfolded in a flurry of methodical, frantic activity. A secure corridor to the cave was established, and a forensic team moved in to document and recover the evidence. Frank was persuaded to remain outside, though every fiber of his being screamed to go in and see for himself. As dusk settled, the first concrete findings began to emerge. Photographs of the remains, of the backpack they found, of the message on the wall. Frank, sitting on a nearby rock, looked up as Reeves approached him with a digital tablet. "Frank," the detective said softly, "we found this among the belongings. I think you should see it." On the screen was the image of an open wallet, a driver's license clearly visible. The photograph of Nathan Wells stared out from the official document. Frank reached a trembling hand toward the screen as if he could touch his son through the glass. "It's him," he whispered. "I'm so sorry," Reeves said, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. What? What happened? How did he end up in there?" "We're still piecing it together, but it looks like Nathan and Amber fell into this cave by accident. From what we can determine, the entrance would have been much larger back in 1998, likely concealed by vegetation. Then a rock slide occurred, blocking the main way out." Frank nodded slowly, trying to process the information. "And the message you mentioned?" Reeves swiped his finger across the screen, revealing another photograph. On the cave's rock face, illuminated by the forensic team's lights, were words scraped into the stone. "Amber escaped. Search north. 3 clicks. Cabin. Help." The words struck Frank like a physical blow. "Amber escaped," he repeated. "That means Nathan." "Based on the preliminary evidence," Reeves explained carefully, "it seems Nathan was trapped by the rock slide. He likely injured his leg. There are fractures to the femur consistent with that, but it appears Amber found another way out, a smaller opening she could squeeze through. And Nathan stayed behind to carve the message and the coordinates," Frank concluded, the pieces clicking into place with agonizing clarity, "so that someone could find her." "That's what we believe," Reeves nodded. "He carved the coordinates on the rock outside to guide anyone searching to this cave, and he left this message inside to explain where to look for Amber." Frank stood up abruptly. "Then we have to go north, like the message says, If Amber escaped in that direction, we've already sent a team, Reeves assured him. They're tracking approximately 3 kilometers north of here, looking for any structure that could be the cabin. As night fell over the Ozark Mountains, Frank remained by the established perimeter, watching the forensic technicians continue their meticulous work. The news that Nathan's remains had been found was relayed to Amber's parents, who were now on their way from Chicago. The next morning, the team that had set out to the north returned with disturbing news. "We found a cabin," the group leader reported to Reeves. "It's abandoned. Looks like no one's lived there in years, but there are signs someone was held captive there at some point." Reeves frowned. "Captive? There's a room with locks on the outside. We found hash marks on the wall, like someone was counting the days, and there are stains that could be blood, though we'll need analysis to confirm." The investigation took a sinister turn. What had initially appeared to be a tragic accident now pointed to something far darker. If Amber had escaped the cave only to encounter something or someone worse in that isolated cabin, the case was transforming into a possible homicide. Forensic technicians moved to the cabin, treating it as a second crime scene. Every inch was photographed, every surface dusted for fingerprints or swabbed for DNA. The stains were analyzed and confirmed to be human blood. "We need to expand the search," Reeves ordered. "If Amber was here, we need to find evidence of what happened to her next." For 3 days, search teams methodically combed the area surrounding the cabin. It was on the 3rd day that an officer with a K-9 unit made the discovery. "Over here!" he shouted, pointing to an area where the earth looked to have been disturbed years ago. The area was immediately cordoned off. Forensic archaeologists worked with extreme care, removing layer after layer of soil. Half a meter down, they found what they had feared: human remains. Preliminary analysis confirmed what they suspected. The remains belonged to a young woman, consistent with the age and height of Amber Collins. The cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. For Frank, the revelation was devastating, but it was also a release. After 8 years of uncertainty, he finally knew what had happened. Nathan and Amber had suffered a terrible accident falling into that cave. Nathan, injured, had been trapped by a rock slide, while Amber managed to escape only to meet an even more terrible fate. But a fundamental question remained unanswered. Who had held Amber captive in that cabin? Who had murdered her? The answer would come in the most unexpected way. The abandoned cabin became the center of a full-scale criminal investigation. "Who owns this property?" Reeves asked one of the local officers as he watched the technicians work. "That's the problem," the officer replied. "The cabin isn't on any official record. It's built on state land, technically illegally. How is it possible no one ever reported it? We're in one of the most remote parts of the Ozarks," the officer explained. "Rangers rarely patrol this far off the marked trails, and it's well camouflaged. Whoever lived here was a survival expert." Inside, the crude structure consisted of a main room, a small kitchen, a basic bathroom, and the unsettling room with the exterior locks. The walls were decorated with animal hides and strange wood carvings. Meanwhile, Frank Wells had temporarily returned to civilization to meet with Amber's parents. The reunion was emotional and painful, a group bound by shared grief but also by the relief of finally knowing the truth. "Nathan tried to save her," Frank told them, clinging to that small piece of solace. "Even trapped and injured, he used his last strength to leave clues that could lead to her." Diana Collins nodded through her tear. "Our greatest fear was always not knowing. At least now, we can say a proper goodbye." Back on the mountain, the case took an unexpected turn when a technician urgently called for Reeves. "Detective, we found viable fingerprints on several objects in the cabin," he reported. We've already run them through AFIS. And? Reeves asked, sensing they were close to a breakthrough. We got a match, the technician said, handing him a tablet. Curtis Blackwood, age 52, has a record for assault and harassment in Tennessee about 15 years ago, but he dropped off the radar after serving a minimal sentence. Reeves studied the man's photograph. A thick beard, sunken eyes, a sullen expression. A face that seemed to belong to another century. Where is he now? That's the interesting part, the technician replied. He lives in Riverdale, a town about 80 kilometers from here. Works as a night janitor at the local high school. The irony was chilling. For 8 years, while the family suffered and searches scoured the mountains, the alleged killer of Amber Collins had been living a quiet life less than an hour away. Reeves immediately organized an operation. At 11:30 that night, 3 patrol cars with no lights or sirens pulled up in front of Riverdale High School. Reeves and 5 officers entered silently through the main doors, which had been left unlocked for the cleaning staff. They found Curtis Blackwood mopping the main hallway, humming distractedly to himself. He offered no resistance when they informed him he was under arrest. Why? Was his only question, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his rugged appearance. For the murder of Amber Collins, Reeves replied, watching his reaction carefully. For an instant, something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Recognition, perhaps guilt, but his face quickly became a blank mask. I don't know who you're talking about, he said. During the subsequent interrogation, Blackwood maintained his denial. He admitted the cabin was his, a place to hunt and be alone, he claimed, but denied ever abducting or harming anyone. His alibi, however, was non-existent. In 1998, Blackwood had been living completely off the grid. The case against him began to build methodically. Fibers found in the cabin matched clothing in his apartment. Tools from his home showed the same distinctive markings as those on the rock where Nathan had carved the coordinates, suggesting Blackwood had tried and failed to erase them. The most disturbing discovery came from a spool-locked shed behind his apartment. Inside a box, they found personal items, a woman's watch, a beaded bracelet, and a Nikon camera. Frank Wells identified the camera immediately. It was Nathan's, he confirmed, his voice breaking. I gave it to him for his college graduation. Miraculously, the roll of film inside was still intact. Technicians carefully developed it, revealing the last photographs Nathan Wells ever took. Landscapes of the Ozarks, Amber smiling by a tree at sunset, and a final partial image that appeared to show the entrance to a cave. With the evidence mounting, prosecutors filed formal charges against Curtis Blackwood for kidnapping and first-degree murder. Though he continued to deny his guilt, DNA ultimately sealed his fate. Samples recovered from beneath Amber's fingernails matched his genetic profile. The investigators' theory took its final shape. Nathan and Amber had fallen into the cave. Nathan was trapped, but Amber escaped. Disoriented and seeking help, she stumbled upon Blackwood's cabin. Instead of helping her, he held her captive. When she eventually tried to escape, he murdered her and buried her body nearby. The trial drew national attention. Curtis Blackwood sat impassively in the courtroom, looking more like a disinterested spectator than the central defendant. He showed no emotion as the jury delivered its unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, he finally spoke, addressing the Wells and Collins families directly. I'm not a monster, he said in that soft voice that so starkly contrasted with his appearance. She showed up at my door, hurt and confused. I just wanted to take care of her. She didn't understand. She didn't understand that she couldn't stay with me forever. His words, far from offering comfort, only confirmed the disturbed reality he inhabited. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A week after the verdict, proper funeral services were held for Nathan and Amber. Their remains were buried side by side. At the service, Frank shared his son's last heroic act. Nathan, even as he was dying, thought of Amber. He used his last strength to leave a trail. He didn't know it would be 8 years before someone found it. But he never gave up hope that one day they would. A month later, Frank Wells returned to the Ozark Mountains alone. He hiked to the spot where his son had carved the coordinates into the stone. There he placed a small memorial plaque. Nathan Wells and Amber Collins, 1972-1998. True love leaves a mark that even time cannot erase. As he walked back down the mountain, Frank reflected on how a simple act of carving coordinates into a rock had finally solved an 8-year mystery, brought justice to the victims, and allowed 2 families to begin to heal. The Ozark Mountains now held one less secret. 2 years after the trial, life in the Ozarks had returned to a semblance of normality. For Frank Wells, however, time moved differently. Though he had found a measure of peace, he still made regular visits to the small memorial plaque in the mountains. On one of these trips, he found an unexpected surprise. A young woman was kneeling before the plaque, placing wildflowers at its base. Frank stopped a short distance away, respecting the moment. When she finally stood and turned, their eyes met. "I'm sorry," she said, visibly flustered. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Don't worry about it," Frank replied gently. "Did you know Nathan or Amber?" The woman shook her head. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple braid, and she wore the uniform of the U.S. Forest Service. "My name is Jessica Ramirez," she introduced herself. "I'm a ranger in this area, and I was involved in the investigation indirectly." Frank studied her with renewed interest. "How so?" Jessica hesitated for a moment before she answered. "It was me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I was the one who reported Curtis Blackwood's strange behavior at the school where he worked. He always seemed unsettling, especially his interest in the younger female students." The revelation stunned Frank. This detail had never come up during the trial. "Then why didn't you testify?" Jessica's gaze drifted toward the mountainous horizon. "I gave a written statement, but the prosecutor decided my testimony wasn't necessary. They had more than enough physical evidence." Frank nodded slowly. The case against Blackwood had been irrefutable, built on a foundation of DNA and the victim's personal belongings found in his possession. After a moment of silence, Jessica spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think Blackwood acted alone?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "It's just a feeling," she replied, choosing her words with care. "During the investigation, some things never quite added up. For example, how did he know exactly where to look to find and eliminate the coordinates Nathan had carved? That area is immense." Frank had never considered this angle. The idea that more people could be involved in the deaths of Nathan and Amber was deeply disturbing, yet also inexplicably compelling. "Have you shared these concerns with the authorities?" Jessica nodded. "With Detective Reeves before he retired, he told me he'd follow any credible lead, but that they wouldn't open new lines of inquiry without concrete evidence." The conversation planted a seed of doubt in Frank's mind. In the days that followed, he replayed every detail of the case, every piece of evidence presented at trial. Had they missed something? A week later, he contacted Marcus Reeves, now retired and living in a lake house on the outskirts of St. Louis. The former detective greeted him with warmth, but also with visible concern. "Frank, it's good to see you, but I have to be honest," Reeves said as they shared a coffee on his porch. "I'm worried you're looking for answers where there are none." "I just need to be sure," Frank replied. "The park ranger, Jessica Ramirez, mentioned some inconsistencies." Reeves sighed. I know her. She's a good, dedicated officer, but sometimes she sees patterns that aren't there. What about this accomplice theory? Reeves set his mug down on the table with deliberate slowness. Frank, we investigated that possibility exhaustively. Blackwood was a loner. He had no friends, no correspondence, no technology. He lived completely cut off from the world. Except when he was working at the school, Frank pointed out. A night job with minimal social interaction, Reeves countered, chosen for that very reason. Despite the logic in Reeves's words, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. He decided to investigate on his own, starting with the school where Blackwood had worked. Riverdale High School was a red brick building typical of any small American town. Frank introduced himself as a private investigator working on a book about the case. A white lie that granted him access to information that would have otherwise been difficult to obtain. The current principal, a man named Richard Tanner, had held the position during the years Blackwood was employed there. He was invisible, Tanner remarked as they reviewed old personnel files. Did his job efficiently and never caused any trouble. Nobody pays much attention to the night janitor. Did you notice any particular relationships between Blackwood and other staff members? Tanner frowned, thinking. Not really, although, now that you mention it. Yes, Frank pressed. I used to see him talking occasionally with the old PE teacher, Walter Kerr. Nothing suspicious, I just noticed they seemed to know each other. Frank jotted down the name. Is Kerr still working here? No, Tanner replied. He took an early retirement right after Blackwood was arrested. Said he wanted to devote his time to fishing. Bought a cabin up near Table Rock Lake. The timing sent an alarm bell ringing in Frank's mind. A sudden retirement right after Blackwood's arrest could mean nothing, but it was a thread that demanded to be pulled. Frank shared his findings with Jessica Ramirez, who agreed to help him in her spare time. Together they built a profile of Walter Kerr, 65 years old, divorced, no children, 30 years as a PE teacher, an avid hunter and fisherman. He doesn't seem like the type to associate with someone like Blackwood, Jessica commented as they reviewed the information. Predators often seem like normal people, Frank replied. It's how they operate without raising suspicion. They decided to visit Kerr's cabin at Table Rock Lake, about a 2-hour drive from Riverdale. They posed as real estate agents interested in nearby properties, another lie Frank justified in the name of finding the truth. Walter Kerr turned out to be a stout, jovial man with white hair and a sun-weathered face. He invited them in without hesitation, proud to show off his modest but cozy cabin. Been thinking of selling and moving down to Florida, he commented, offering them iced tea. The winters here can be hard on these old bones. Frank carefully observed every detail. The photographs on the walls, Kerr fishing, Kerr with students. The books on the shelves, mostly mystery novels and survival manuals. The fishing trophies. Nice place, Frank commented, gesturing toward a closed door. What's in there? Oh, that's my workshop, Kerr answered casually. Woodworking, mostly. A hobby I picked up after I retired. Something in his tone, too casual, too rehearsed, put Frank's senses on high alert. As they left, Frank and Jessica shared their impressions. He seems harmless, Jessica admitted. But there's something, I can't put my finger on it. I know, Frank agreed. That locked door. I'd bet my life there's more than woodworking tools in there. They knew they needed to see inside that workshop. But legally, their options were limited. Frank contacted Reeves again, sharing his suspicions. Frank, you're walking on very thin ice, the ex-detective warned. If Kerr is involved, tipping him off could be dangerous, and if he's not, you could be harassing an innocent man. I need to know the truth, Frank insisted. For Nathan. For Amber. Reeves sighed heavily. Let me make some calls. I might be able to get a current detective to take a discreet look, but we need legitimate grounds, not just a hunch. The opportunity came unexpectedly 2 days later. Walter Kerr was hospitalized after suffering an apparent heart attack while fishing. With Kerr in the hospital, the authorities were able to obtain a search warrant based on the connection to Blackwood and some inconsistencies in Kerr's financial history that Reeves had managed to uncover. What they found in the locked workshop would change the entire narrative of the case. The room hidden behind that unassuming door was not a workshop. Instead of woodworking tools, investigators found a meticulously organized space that functioned as a personal archive. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed with chronologically labeled boxes. A large table in the center held an old computer, a printer, and stacks of neatly sorted documents. "What in the hell is all this?" muttered Detective Harlow, who had taken over the case after Reeves's retirement. Frank, whom Reeves had managed to get on site, stepped toward one of the boxes. The label read 1995-1998. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside were meticulously organized folders, each containing photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Frank pulled out a folder at random and opened it. His heart stopped. "Detective," he called out, his voice cracking. "You need to see this." The folder contained photographs of a young woman hiking, pictures clearly taken without her knowledge, from a distance through the trees. The final images showed the same woman in what looked like Blackwood's cabin, tied to a chair. The name on the folder's tab read, Emily Gonzalez, May 1996. "Emily Gonzalez," Harlow repeated, his face pale. "She disappeared on a hiking trip in '96. They never found her." They checked more folders, more names, more photographs. Young women, all in similar situations. First photographed unknowingly in the mountains, then documented in captivity. "My God," whispered Jessica Ramirez, who had been allowed to join as a representative of the Forest Service. It wasn't just Amber. As forensic technicians processed the room, a disturbing pattern emerged. Walter Kerr had been methodically documenting Curtis Blackwood's activities for years. Not as an investigator or a concerned witness, but as a partner, perhaps even the instigator. "Look at this," one of the technicians called out, pointing to the computer they had managed to unlock. "There's a digital journal." The journal entries revealed the true nature of the relationship between Kerr and Blackwood. Kerr, the operational mastermind, identified potential victims, mostly solo hikers or vulnerable couples in remote areas. Blackwood, the enforcer, would intercept them and bring them to his cabin. "It was a coordinated operation," Harlow explained, horrified. Kerr, from his respected position as a teacher, provided the perfect cover. Blackwood, the social recluse, did the dirty work. Frank found the folder labeled Wells/Collins, May 1998. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he opened it. The first photograph showed Nathan and Amber at the trailhead unloading gear from their car. Kerr had marked them as targets from the start, but the subsequent entries revealed something unexpected. There were no photographs of the couple at the cabin. Instead, there were frantic notes. Plan altered. Couple deviated from trail, fell into cavern before interception. B reports male trapped in rockfall. Female escaped through secondary opening. B intercepted her, disoriented, in the woods. Frank felt a mixture of horror and a twisted sense of relief. Nathan and Amber hadn't been specific targets, but victims of a terrible coincidence. Their accident in the cave had disrupted Kerr and Blackwood's original plan. But Amber, in her disoriented escape, had the profound misfortune of running right into Blackwood. The following entries documented Amber's captivity and her tragic end, all recorded with a clinical coldness as if Kerr were a scientist logging an experiment. "There's more," a technician announced. "We found a hidden compartment under the floorboards." The contents of the compartment took the case to an even more disturbing level. Dozens of personal items, jewelry, IDs, small diaries, trophies from victims who had never been reported missing, or whose disappearances had never been connected to the Ozarks region. "This is so much bigger than we ever imagined," Harlow said, visibly shaken. "We're talking about a series of crimes that spans decades, not years." As the investigators continued to process the scene, Frank stepped out onto the cabin's porch, needing fresh air. Jessica followed, equally disturbed. "I don't understand," Frank said after a long silence. "Why didn't Blackwood ever implicate Kerr? He could have negotiated a reduced sentence." Jessica thought for a moment before answering. "Control. Based on what we're seeing, Kerr had absolute psychological control over Blackwood. He likely manipulated him into taking the full blame." "And Kerr would have walked free," Frank added, the thought turning his stomach. "Maybe even found another accomplice." At the hospital, Walter Kerr was slowly recovering from his heart attack, completely unaware that his meticulous archive had been discovered. When Detective Harlow walked into his room, flanked by two officers, his expression shifted from surprise to understanding, and finally to a strange, unsettling calm. "I suppose you found my workshop," he said simply. "Walter Kerr, you are under arrest for kidnapping, complicity in multiple homicides, and obstruction of justice," Harlow recited as an officer cuffed him to the hospital bed. "Interesting choice of charges," Kerr remarked with a chilling coolness. "Complicity? I'd say Curtis was the accomplice. He was always my project." Kerr's confession, recorded in that hospital room, revealed the true magnitude of the horror. For over 30 years, he had been methodically hunting in the Ozark Mountains. Blackwood, a former student with clear mental health issues, had been recruited as his assistant 15 years prior. "He wasn't difficult to mold," Kerr explained with unnerving calm. "He needed companionship, direction. I provided both." When asked why he had documented everything so meticulously, Kerr answered with the twisted logic of a true sociopath. "Memory is imperfect. I wanted to remember every detail, every expression. Those are moments you can't replicate." The case now stretched far beyond Nathan and Amber. Authorities identified 23 confirmed victims over 3 decades, and they suspected there were more who might never be found. For Frank Wells, the new discoveries brought a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, they confirmed that Nathan's death had been a genuine accident, not the result of being specifically chosen by a predator. On the other, the idea that Amber had escaped one danger only to fall into another, infinitely worse, was heartbreaking. A week after Kerr's arrest, Frank visited Amber's parents to share the new information personally. The conversation was painful but necessary. "In a way," Robert Collins reflected, "it's a relief to know they weren't deliberately chosen, that it was just a terrible coincidence." "Nathan tried to save her until the very end," Frank added. "The coordinates, the message in the cave. He did everything he could." Diana Collins took Frank's hand in hers. "They'd be middle-aged now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Maybe with children of their own. That's what hurts the most, thinking of all the life they never got to live." The trial of Walter Kerr became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Missouri history. Unlike Blackwood, Kerr showed no remorse. He pleaded guilty to all charges, but his attitude during the sentencing hearings was one of complete indifference. "I regret nothing," he declared to the court. "I lived life on my own terms." The judge sentenced him to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At the age of 65, Walter Kerr would die in prison. As for Curtis Blackwood, prosecutors had considered offering him a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against Kerr, but they ultimately decided against it. The evidence recovered from Kerr's cabin was overwhelming, more than enough to guarantee a conviction. To lessen Blackwood's sentence would have been a profound insult to the families of the victims. A year after Kerr's arrest, the United States Forest Service established a memorial in the Ozark Mountains, dedicated to the memory of all the identified victims. Frank Wells attended the dedication ceremony, accompanied by Jessica Ramirez. The two had forged a friendship built on mutual respect and their shared search for the truth. As they gazed at the commemorative plaque listing the victims' names, Frank reflected on the long, torturous path he had walked since that May day in 1998, when his son missed his promised call. "Do you think there's finally justice?" Jessica asked softly. Frank contemplated the question for a long moment before answering. "There's no perfect justice for something like this," he said at last, "but there is truth, and sometimes the truth is the best we can hope for." The Ozarks case, as it had become known in the national media, sparked a renewed interest in unsolved disappearances in natural areas across the country. Investigators and journalists began to examine similar patterns, wondering just how many other Walter Kerrs might be operating in the vast wilderness of America. 3 years after Kerr's trial, Frank Wells had found a new purpose. His experience had driven him to found Project Coordinates, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the families of those who had gone missing in national parks and wilderness areas. The organization provided resources, coordinated searches with trained volunteers, and offered emotional support to families navigating the same agonizing uncertainty he had once known. Jessica Ramirez had joined the organization as its field coordinator, using her experience as a park ranger to train the search teams. Her friendship with Frank had deepened over the years, forged in their shared commitment and the trauma they had faced together. On a crisp autumn morning, Frank was reviewing pending cases in the small office that served as the headquarters for Project Coordinates when he received an unexpected call. "Mr. Wells, this is Dr. Lauren Chen from the Jefferson City Correctional Medical Center," a professional voice said. "Curtis Blackwood has requested to speak with you." Frank felt as if time had recoiled. It had been years since he'd given Blackwood a direct thought, his focus always fixed on the architect of the horror, Walter Kerr. "Did he say why he wants to see me?" Frank asked, his voice steadier than he expected. "He claims to have important information related to your son and other victims, information he never shared during the original investigation," the doctor replied. "I should warn you, Mr. Wells, Blackwood is in the terminal stages of pancreatic cancer. His doctors estimate he has less than 2 months." Frank considered the request. A part of him wanted to refuse immediately. What could Blackwood possibly say that would matter now? But another part, the part that had dedicated years to searching for answers, could not ignore the possibility of learning more. "I'll be there tomorrow," he finally replied. That night, Frank called Amber's parents to inform them of Blackwood's request. Robert Collins reacted with bitterness. What could he possibly say now that would change anything? "He's a dying man looking to clear his conscience," he said with contempt. "I understand if you don't want me to go," Frank replied. I won't do anything that might cause you more pain." There was a long silence before Diana Collins took the phone. "Go, Frank," she said. "If there's any chance of getting more answers, I think we should know them. Not for him, for Amber and Nathan." The next day, Frank drove to the Correctional Medical Center. As he followed a guard through sterile corridors, he mentally rehearsed the questions he had considered throughout the night. Curtis Blackwood was a shadow of the man Frank remembered from the trial. The cancer had consumed him, reducing him to little more than skin stretched over bone. His eyes, however, held the same strange clarity Frank remembered. "Mr. Wells," Blackwood rasped from the hospital bed, "thank you for coming." Frank remained standing, keeping his distance. "Dr. Chen said you have information." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I'm going to die soon. I'm not looking for forgiveness, not from you, not from anyone, but there are things you should know, things I never said." "I'm listening," Frank replied, his expression neutral. "Walter didn't act alone," Blackwood began, his voice hoarse but firm. "There were others, a network." Frank felt the floor shift beneath his feet. "What do you mean, a network?" "People in positions of authority, park rangers, cops, even a judge in the next county. Not all of them were active participants, but they knew. They looked the other way, some of them. Some of them received photographs, videos." The idea was so monstrous, Frank almost rejected it instinctively. But after everything he had uncovered over the past few years, he knew he couldn't dismiss anything, no matter how horrific. "Do you have names?" Blackwood gave a weak nod. "I wrote them down, it's all here," he said, gesturing to an envelope on the bedside table. "Names, dates, places, everything I remember." "Why now?" Frank asked, not yet touching the envelope. "Why not when you were arrested?" A sad smile crossed Blackwood's emaciated face. "Fear. Walter had me convinced that if I talked, his associates would make my time in prison unbearable, and he was right. They tried to kill me twice during that first year. After that, they moved me here for my own safety. And you expect me to believe you were just another one of Kerr's victims?" Frank couldn't keep the contempt from his voice. "No," Blackwood answered with surprising clarity. "I did what I did. I'm as guilty as Walter, more maybe because my hands were the ones stained with it, but the truth is bigger than my guilt or Walter's." Frank finally took the envelope. It felt as heavy as lead. "There's something else you should know," Blackwood added, his voice now barely a whisper. "About your son. He died a hero, and not just because of the coordinates. When I found the girl, Amber, wandering lost in the woods, she told me about him, about how he stayed behind so she could escape. He could have gone first, but he let her go. He made sure she had a chance." Frank felt tears burn his eyes, but he refused to shed them in front of this man. "She fought," Blackwood continued, "harder than any of them. She never gave up, tried to escape 3 times. The last time she almost made it." "Enough," Frank interrupted, unable to bear any more. Blackwood nodded, respecting the boundary. "I just wanted you to know. They were both extraordinary. I knew it then. I've always known." Frank left the room without another word, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. In the hallway, he stopped, leaning against the wall as a wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. After regaining his composure, he immediately called Detective Harlow, who was still on active duty and had continued to investigate loose ends from the Kerr case. "I need to see you," Frank said. "Blackwood just gave me something. It could change everything we thought we knew about this case." That same afternoon, Frank, Harlow, and Jessica Ramirez met in the detective's office. Together, they examined the contents of the envelope. Page after page of names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of Kerr's alleged network. "This is monumental," Harlow murmured, scanning the lists. "If even half of this is true, we're looking at a criminal conspiracy that spans decades in multiple jurisdictions." "Do you think he was telling the truth?" Jessica asked, studying Blackwood's notes. "A dying man rarely has a reason to lie," Frank replied. "And there are details in here we can verify." Harlow nodded, his expression grim. I'm going to need federal help on this. It's too big for our department. The following months triggered one of the most extensive investigations in the history of Missouri. FBI agents joined the case, meticulously following every lead Blackwood had provided. Curtis Blackwood died 2 weeks after his meeting with Frank, taking many secrets to his grave, but the seeds he had planted with his confession had begun to sprout. One by one, the names on his list were investigated. Some were already dead, others had retired to seemingly respectable lives. But as investigators dug deeper, disturbing patterns of cover-ups and complicity began to emerge. A former police officer, now retired in Florida, was the first to break when FBI agents knocked on his door. His testimony corroborated Blackwood's claims and added new names to the investigation. For Frank, each new revelation was like reopening a wound that had just begun to heal. But he also felt a renewed sense of determination. The project he had started to help families like his own now became a tool to expose a system of predation that had remained hidden for decades. "This goes so far beyond Nathan and Amber now," he told Jessica one evening as they reviewed new investigation documents. "This is about all the victims who never had a voice and about making sure something like this can never happen again." Jessica nodded, squeezing his hand in a gesture of support. "And it's about honoring what Nathan did. He didn't just die trying to save Amber. He left clues that eventually exposed all of this." Frank reflected on her words. His son, without knowing it, had started a chain of events that was now unmasking a network of evil that had operated in the shadows for far too long. The truth, as it so often is, turned out to be more complex and far darker than anyone could have imagined. 5 years after Curtis Blackwood's confession, the small conference room at the Department of Justice in Kansas City was packed. Federal prosecutors, FBI agents, local detectives, and the families of victims had gathered for what everyone hoped would be the final chapter in an investigation that had shaken the foundations of justice in Missouri. Frank Wells sat in the front row next to Robert and Diana Collins. Beside him was Jessica Ramirez, who had been with him every step of this long journey. Detective Marcus Reeves, who had come out of retirement to consult on the sprawling investigation, sat behind them. U.S. Attorney Elaine Morrow, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes and a reputation for unwavering integrity, stood before the group. "I want to thank all of you for being here today," she began, "especially the families who have endured not only the loss of their loved ones but years of unanswered questions and in some cases negligent or deliberately sabotaged investigations." Frank unconsciously tightened his grip on the arm of his chair. After 5 years of meticulous investigation, Blackwood's revelations had been confirmed and expanded upon. The network was real. An informal but effective group of individuals in positions of authority who had facilitated, covered up, or directly participated in Walter Kerr's crimes. Today I can announce that a federal grand jury has returned indictments against 15 additional individuals connected to the crimes perpetrated in the Ozark Mountains between 1975 and 2006, Morrow announced. Among the indicted are 3 former police officers, 2 former park rangers, a retired district judge, and several civilians who held positions of influence in their communities. A murmur swept through the room. Although many present already knew the scope of the conspiracy, hearing the charges formalized was still a shock. The charges include conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, evidence tampering, and in some cases direct participation in acts of violence against the victims, Morrow detailed, her voice steady despite the disturbing nature of the list. Frank watched Amber's parents as they absorbed the information. Diana Collins remained composed, but silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Robert held her hand so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Additionally, the attorney continued, we have definitively identified 37 victims spanning 3 decades. 22 of them were previously unsolved missing persons cases. Thanks to the evidence recovered, we have been able to provide answers to families who have waited decades for the truth. When the formal presentation concluded, the U.S. attorney approached Frank and the Collinses personally. We would not have reached this point without your persistence, she told them. Especially you, Mr. Wells. Your refusal to give up even years after the initial events is what ultimately unraveled this entire conspiracy. Frank shook his head modestly. I only followed the path my son started. Nathan left the clues that led to all of this. And Amber, Robert Collins added, his voice thick with emotion but firm, she never gave up. Even in the worst of circumstances, she kept fighting. After the meeting, Frank walked outside with Jessica. The day was surprisingly beautiful. The bright blue sky, a stark contrast to the darkness of the topics they had just discussed. How are you feeling? Jessica asked softly. Frank considered the question for a long moment. Relief, I suppose, in a sense of finality, but it also makes me wonder how many other cases like this are still out there, unsolved. How many families are still waiting for answers that may never come? Jessica nodded in understanding. That's why Project Coordinates is so important. What you've built is making a real difference. In the 5 years since Blackwood's confession, Project Coordinates had grown substantially. With Frank as director and Jessica as head of field operations, the organization now had offices in 6 states and hundreds of trained volunteers. They had helped solve dozens of missing persons cases and provided support to countless families. There's something else I've been thinking about, Frank said as they sat on a bench in front of the building. It all started with those coordinates Nathan carved into the stone. A final, desperate act that didn't pay off immediately but eventually changed everything. A message in a bottle, Jessica mused, cast out with hope, but no guarantee anyone would ever find it. Exactly. And it makes me think, how many other messages are out there, just waiting to be discovered? Evidence, clues, signs that could solve a case if only someone knew where to look. That conversation planted the seed for the next evolution of Project Coordinates. A dedicated initiative was launched to document and analyze any potential messages left behind by the victims. They looked for markings carved into trees, for trails subtly rearranged, any sign that might seem natural to a casual observer, but could, in fact, contain vital information. 6 months after the federal indictments, the trials began. Frank attended every single one, sometimes with the Collinses, other times with Jessica or Reeves. It was emotionally draining, but he felt a duty to be there, to look every person who had allowed the horror to continue directly in the eye. The retired judge, Marshall Donovan, was the last to face trial. For years he had dismissed cases, tampered with evidence, and ensured that any investigation getting too close to Kerr's network was either redirected or shut down entirely. During his testimony, Donovan finally revealed the network's origin, a group of hunters who had met in the 1970s. They were bound at first by a shared passion for the sport, but their appetites had gradually twisted into something far darker. Walter Kerr had been the catalyst, the one who suggested the thrill of the hunt could be extended to human prey. I didn't participate directly, Donovan testified, as if that somehow lessened his guilt. I just facilitated things. I made sure certain investigations never went anywhere. And that makes him less responsible? Frank asked Jessica after the testimony. The fact that he didn't get his own hands dirty? In some ways, it makes him more culpable, she replied. He used the authority entrusted to him to protect predators. He betrayed not only the victims but the entire justice system. Donovan was sentenced to life in prison, as were most of the accused. Some of the lesser accomplices received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation, but none escaped significant time behind bars. The day the final sentence was handed down, Frank visited the memorial in the Ozark Mountains, now expanded to include the names of every identified victim. He placed fresh flowers beside the names of Nathan and Amber, just as he did every year on the anniversary of their disappearance. This time, however, something was different. There was a sense of closure, of a circle finally complete. Justice, however terribly delayed, had at last been served. Frank sat on a nearby rock, gazing out at the landscape before him. The Ozarks were beautiful, with their dense forests and serene valleys. It was hard to reconcile such natural beauty with the horrors that had taken place here. "I promised you I'd find the truth," he said softly, as if Nathan and Amber could hear him. "It took longer than I ever expected, but I kept that promise." As he returned to his car, Frank noticed a young couple preparing for a hike. They had well-equipped backpacks, maps, and most importantly, a GPS device and an emergency locator. "Excuse me," he called out. "Are you heading for the trails?" The couple nodded, smiling. "It's our first time in the Ozarks," the young man replied. Frank offered them a small card from the Coordinates Project. "Just a piece of advice. Always let someone know exactly where you're going and when you expect to be back. And take this. It has safety information and emergency numbers." "Thank you," the woman said, taking the card. "We've heard stories about what happened here years ago. It's terrifying to think about." "The mountains are safe now," Frank assured them. "Just be cautious, as you should be in any wilderness area." As he drove away, Frank reflected on how Nathan and Amber's legacy lived on. Their tragic deaths had ultimately led to the exposure of a predator network, the resolution of dozens of cold cases, and now, through the Coordinates Project, the protection of future hikers. The coordinates, desperately scratched into a stone by a dying young man, had become so much more than a geographical location. They had transformed into a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the unyielding search for truth. Frank took one last look toward the memorial before getting into his car. "Rest in peace," he murmured. "Your story will not be forgotten."